Hey, everybody, this is Gene Marks, and welcome to another episode of Biz Books. Thanks so much for joining me. I am here speaking with Bob Chalfin. Bob, first, I can call you Bob, right? I know your full name is
That would be great.
Okay, that's good. Bob has written a practical guide to buying a business, locating a business, performing due diligence, valuing the enterprise, raising funds, and closing the deal. It's a great book with chock full of information for any business owner or investor that's looking to buy into an existing business. So first of all, Bob, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about you for starters. What brought you to writing this book?
Well, that's what I do. I provide advisory services in connection with the purchase and sale of closely held businesses. By training, I'm an attorney and a CPA, but most of my work is working as an advisor. And for the last 32 years, I've taught at Wharton, and for about 29 of those years, I've taught a course entitled Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, which goes through the process of locating, analyzing, valuing, and buying a closely held business.
You know, it's funny, and we're going to dig into the details of the book, but it's funny that you bring that up about entrepreneurship through acquisition. It's like, since COVID, there's been like 10 to 15 million new startup applications filed with the Census Bureau. There's been this explosion in startup businesses, and the vast majority, I'm sure are side gigs and freelancers and people that are very individual kind of based. But don't you feel that we're in a generational change? The millennials that we talk about now are now becoming. There's some older millennials that are part of that generation that have been in the workforce for a good 10 years or so. And what are your thoughts on buying a new business versus starting one up from scratch? To me, it just seems, if I was to advise anyone who was looking to get into business on their own, my first piece of advice would be like, you might want to consider buying something that already exists. What are your thoughts on that?
The two paths are not mutually exclusive. You could buy a business and use that as the base to start new businesses off of that. You could start a business and buy other businesses that could help you fulfill that. But I do like the idea of buying a business because it has an existing cash flow. It has a workforce. It has customers. It has suppliers. There's a whole infrastructure that makes it, I think, less risky and more predictable.
Yeah, I agree. And it also has an existing owner of a business that might stick around for a little bit and kind of mentor you through, growing it and managing it,
Well, that's one aspect that I encourage everyone to do, is that when you're talking to a business owner about buying their business, try to figure out what they're best at and what they enjoy doing, just so you can encourage them to stay after the business is purchased, just to maintain the longevity and the ultimate momentum of the business.
Makes sense. That makes sense. All right, let's dig into the book, because there's a lot of great information in this book that I want to make sure at least you cover on an overall basis so people can dig into it and learn more. So, early on in the book, you talk about the different types of buyers. You have 5 different types, and don't worry, let me list them out, but I'm going to want your comments on them. You have a synergistic or strategic buyer. You have a focused or cherry picker buyer. You have a financial buyer, an extreme bargain hunter, and the romantics. And I love the romantics part of it, which, I see well too often. But let's go through them, because I think it's important for someone buying a business to know what category they fall into. What do you mean by a synergistic or a strategic buyer?
Well, and in many cases, someone will fall into more than one category.
Okay.
So a synergistic or a strategic buyer, they're saying, well, with what I already have and what I buy, I can make a better business on this. And a lot of the mergers that we read about in the newspapers are strategic buyers, where they want to buy something and move and take advantage of economies of scale and be able to cross-sell each other's products, whether it be the mergers of the various railroads, or when Google has a new acquisition or Microsoft has a new acquisition. Those are some examples of synergistic buyers.
Focused or cherry pickers?
They're looking to buy a business for just one particular aspect of the business, and they may be willing to sell off or just they really don't want the other aspects of the business. So they just want a particular, maybe a piece of intellectual property that they have, or a particular customer base, or a particular product that they want to sell.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And something, I mean, I just had a client that sold their business to a company that only wanted a certain product line of their business, and they had four other product lines, and the buyer actually closed down the other four product lines just to keep the one product line that they knew that they were really after. What about a financial buyer?
Financial buyers just look, in many cases, they're looking for a cash on cash return, a return on investment, return on equity. And a lot of times, you may associate them with private equity firms. But in most cases, someone who's a financial buyer also wants to bring in some synergy to the transaction. So you're going to see both in
Yeah.
many cases.
Yeah, I got to imagine any buyer is a financial buyer for the most part. I mean, if they're buying it for a strategic reason or, a synergistic reason, they've got some return on investment on their minds. But so it's almost an overlap probably with a lot of the other categories.
Yeah, and you'll see that as well.
Yep. Extreme bargain hunters. I think I know what that is.
Well, those are people who are looking to buy a business for pennies on the dollar. The business hasn't. And in many cases, you'll see that in closely held businesses where the owner is encountering health issues, or the owner dies, or they lose a major customer. But in some cases, a business that loses its founder does very well. I mean, think about what happened with Apple after Steve Jobs died. They still have done very well in the last 11 years since he passed away.
Yeah, that makes sense. And finally, there are the romantics.
And I think in many cases, everybody is a bit of a romantic buyer whenever they buy a business. But what comes to mind for romantic buyers, someone wants to buy a business that is in an area where they have a hobby. For example, they have a surfer, or they want to buy a sports team, or they want to buy a business in a particular geography or a particular climate just to be there.
Do you find any one of these categories of buyers to be more successful than the other?
Well, in some cases, romantic buyers are less successful,
Right.
because it may just be an outgrowth of their hobby on this. But I think like the strategic buyers, as well as the focus or the cherry pickers, are generally going to be more successful. The financial buyers, and keep in mind that the financial buyers are based on models that they put together. And 3 years ago, who would have predicted that we would have had a pandemic that we had? I don't think any of us would have predicted the ramifications or the extent of this.
Do you think it's important if I'm looking to buy a business, Bob, should I take the time out to better understand what kind of category or categories of a buyer that I am? Does that help me in the buying process?
It may help you a little, because in some cases people overpay if they're a romantic buyer. They always wanted to own a ski shop. They always wanted to own a model train store or something like that. And they may not be looking at the financial rewards, and with the understanding that business has rewards that are beyond financial in many cases.
Yeah, I also think that, if you take the aspect, or take the position that you're a financial buyer and you're buying something strategically, it takes a little bit of the emotion out of the transaction, and therefore maybe gives you the ability to make some harder decisions. So I can understand why that would be important. Okay. So you talked about these 5 categories of buyers. Then, you talk about in the book as well as that why businesses are.
Can I just go back for a second?
By all means.
A strategic buyer in many cases can pay more for a business than any other buyer, because they're not just buying the business for what it's doing now. They're buying it for what it may do in the future, which could be substantially more than what it's doing right now.
And I'm assuming also strategic buyers, there are occasions where people buy businesses not necessarily for that business to make a profit, but to protect your existing business. If you're buying a competitor, for example, or you're trying to put a product line out of business that's been competing with you. Does that make sense?
That happens. Or maybe you need another aspect of the product line that you don't have and someone else has. And so you're buying that so you could serve your customers completely.
Got it. All right. That's great. Okay. So, next you want to understand, why people are selling their businesses. Why is it important to know this? Like what does that do for you as a buyer?
Well, it lets you understand what their motivations are. But overall, someone wants to sell a business because it's not as satisfying as they want it to be. And they could be selling a business for many reasons. They could be selling it for financial reasons, which either could be they want to diversify their portfolio, or the business needs more money to go to the next level. They may also want to sell it because Um, there's a lot of internal conflict between them and the shareholders and the other people that could sell it for other reasons, such as they think that now is the time that they want to take advantage of an opportunity. And also they may want to change their lifestyle completely.
Is there any type of seller that, for any one of the reasons that you've just mentioned, would be is better for a buyer, puts a buyer in a better negotiating position? For example, if somebody is making a decision to sell their business, as you put it in, because of a lifestyle decision, I'm just done with this. I want to go and play golf,
Right.
as opposed to somebody who just needs, just wants to diversify. Have you found that any types of sellers are, again, more more amenable to negotiation because of the sort of classification that you put them in?
Well, another reason why people might want to sell a business is the business has evolved. It started out, it was them, their sister, and their cousin running the business. And now they got 40, 50, hundreds of employees, and it's just beyond what they ever expected.
Right.
So they realize that it's not time, it's time for them to move on. And in many cases, they could be good sellers. But a lot of times sellers will overvalue their businesses, and that's the give and take between both the buyer and seller. And sometimes the seller has to have their business on the market for a while so they can be disciplined by the market in terms of what's the correct price for the business.
Do you find that, like, sellers, do you think they really know the reasons why they're selling their business? Like, this is what you do for a living. I feel like you can identify this pretty easily and quickly through a 20-minute conversation with a prospective seller. Do you find that most sellers are, are honest enough to say, like, yeah, I need to sell this business because it's a lifestyle decision. It's because of the, where we are in its evolution. What do you find?
In many cases, they may not be honest with themselves.
Yeah.
And they may just want to do it to seize an opportunity. For example, how many of us own stocks today, which we wish we sold in January or December? And, so that's one aspect of it. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. But I think the biggest stumbling block is they need to understand it themselves.
Right, right. I know this book is written for buyers of business, and I know that you have another book, or you're working on another book about
Well, I
selling.
have one other book on a practical guide to selling a business, and many years ago, I wrote a book on how to sell your IT business. I have 3 books in total.
Okay, that's great, because the selling your business side, we should come and revisit that as well. But I almost feel like anybody who wants to sell a book, sell a business, should be, looking at this chapter in particular to understand better why they're selling their business. Does it help a buyer to help the seller understand why they're selling their business? If what I'm getting at, like, it makes it easier for them to go through this transaction once they better understand why.
Well, throughout the entire process, both the buyer and the seller are going to have second thoughts. The
Yeah.
buyer's worried that they're going to overpay, and the seller's worried that they're selling the business for too little. They could have what's known as buyer's remorse.
Right.
And one way for the buyer, the seller could have seller's remorse. I don't remember what I just said. But one way that the buyer could help the seller on this is maybe only buy a portion of the business, or structure the deal so that the seller gets paid based on the business's performance in the future, so they could share in the future growth of the business on this.
Right. I guess it's important for a buyer to remember that for somebody selling their business, in some cases it could be, it's their life's work, or maybe it's a family business. Maybe they've had it, their great grandfather or grandmother started the business, and there's emotions involved here. So it might not be something that can just happen overnight, and you have to be, patient. And you're right. Maybe structure a transaction that's more of a step transaction, or something that happens over a longer period of time. Where I hit that is I have clients, sometimes they do ESOPs, or they sell their businesses to their employees. And that's a big jump, like selling your business to your employees. And I found I wrote a piece on this for the Inquirer, like many of the people I talked to, they did it in portions. They sold 10%, and after a while, I guess you can get just more comfortable with, the concept of letting somebody else have equity in your business.
Yeah, and that's the case. And in some cases, it's almost like wading into a pool. You'll dip one toe in and then the other toe in, and just see if it makes sense and if you're comfortable with it. Because a lot of business owners, whether they started the business or inherited it or bought it, their identity is tied up in their business.
Yeah.
And may, be a big change for them to sell the business. So you as the buyer may want to provide certain accommodations to the seller. For example, give them an office, keep their name on the building, keep their name on certain products, keep them on an advisory conference, allow them to come to major sales meetings or sales events, because they may like this. It's the rewards that you get from owning a business are not only monetary. The clients, the suppliers, the employees have become their friends.
Yeah, that is such great advice. And it's great insight. When you think about, people do love titles, people want to have some kind of a legacy in their lives as well. And you think, if you are buying a business and the seller has some reluctance or is slow to move, and you're like, hey, we'll keep the name of the business. It's named after your grandparents, I commit to keeping that going forward. That could be the tipping point to getting somebody to agree to sell or not. Okay. Let's move on. There's a lot in this book to talk about. You have a whole chapter on the selling memo. Um, Tell me, Bob, what is a selling memo? Why is it important? How do I use it? Give me some of your thoughts on.
Well, the
on the selling
selling
memo.
memo should provide, in summary form, an overview of the business. Because if you buy businesses, you probably learn of many businesses that are for sale every week, every day. And this allows you to look at it in summary form. It should have an executive summary, a page or two that summarize the entire business. It should talk about the history, what it sells, who it sells to, who it buys from, the finances, who the key employees are, any customer concentration, something that's unique about the business in terms of its technology or its product mix or what makes it unique. But at the same time, this may be distributed to a wider audience, so you may want to redact or anonymize some of the names of the key customers or suppliers, so that could only be shared with truly interested buyers later in the process. Excuse me.
Okay. So the selling memo, I kind of equate it to, like, if you're gonna, sell your house, you have that sort of sheet that gives all the information about the house. Is it similar to that? And how long is a typical selling memo? Is it a page or is it 10 pages?
Well, less is more, but 10 pages, 15 or 20 pages, but that 1 or 2 page executive summary should summarize everything.
Okay. Can you give me, an example of, or any thoughts on mistakes you've seen clients make when they put together a selling memo?
I think that they're not candid about the business.
Mm-hmm.
They're not candid about, sellers will always talk about non-recurring expenses, but they don't talk about non-recurring revenues. Think about the businesses now that have construction businesses in Southwest Florida. They're going to be very busy for the next 2 years. God willing, we're not going to have such problems in the future. Or what about the people at the beginning of the pandemic who put in information technology systems so employees could work at home? That's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And they're not going to have that level of business activity in the future, because a lot of this has already been put in place.
Right. Is the selling memo something that you make available to the public? In other words, like on your website that you can download it, or is it something that you recommend to your clients? It has to be requested and there has to be either a waiver or an NDA. I know you've got a whole chapter on NDAs, which we'll talk about soon. But how public do you make this information?
Well, it should not be public. It should only be given to buyers who sign a confidentiality agreement, and more importantly than signing a confidentiality agreement, people that you're comfortable with that will maintain the confidence. Realize that once word gets out that the business is for sale, it could hurt the business. Employees may want to leave. Customers may not want to do business with businesses that are for sale. Suppliers may feel the same way. But at the same time, some of your most likely buyers are your competitors, your customers, and your suppliers. And those are the same people that you may not want to know about. You do not want to let know that the business is for sale.
Yeah, no, I agree. Have you seen any changes in the format of the selling memo over the past few years, Bob? Like, do you see more business owners looking to sell their business, moving towards like doing like a video version of their selling memo, having it more like something like what you and I are doing right now, where they're discussing the information or they're giving a tour of their place, something like that? Or is it still pretty much old school, written document that you request?
It's more, I hate to use that term, but it's right. It's old school. And videos would help, because I encourage people that a picture is worth 1,000 words and a visit is worth 1,000 pictures.
Yeah, I
So the
agree.
more that you could share that information. In fact, during the pandemic, we had people just give us virtual tours while they were walking around with their iPhones at their business. Here's where we manufacture it. Here's where we ship it. And they just had us on FaceTime doing it, or they just recorded it in some other sort of app. And it was great.
Got it. When you're a buyer, and we'll get off this topic in a minute, but it does fascinate me. When you're a buyer and a seller gives you a seller's memo, how can I differentiate a good seller's memo versus a not so good one? I mean, in other words, what red flags would cause you to say like, this business doesn't seem to have its act together?
Well, in many cases, the sellers will overestimate or overvalue their businesses. If the seller does not include reasons why the business may not do well, because realize that there is an element of risk in every business, or better yet, an element of uncertainty, and that has to be considered. And also, they need to discuss the good and the bad, as well as the positives and the negatives about the business.
Okay, that's important to know. Okay. Non-disclosure agreements. So you had mentioned, I mean, they're also called confidentiality agreements. You had mentioned it earlier. If somebody's going to request, if I'm a buyer and I request a seller's memo, I should not be surprised if the seller, requires me to sign an NDA before we start seeing that information. Tell me, as again, this book is for buyers. So tell me what I should expect to see in a non-disclosure agreement, so I'm not surprised or taken aback by any request that's made of me.
Well, the non-disclosure agreement is going to describe what information is confidential, which is generally everything that they give you. And there's some exceptions that are carved out, information you already knew, information that you already knew that is not in violation of any agreement, information in the public domain that's not in violation of any agreement, or information that you developed independently that's not in violation of an agreement. In addition, there should be a carve out that if you're ever subpoenaed for any of the information, you have to provide it.
Right.
And if you get a subpoena, you may want to, it could provide that you let the seller know about it, and it's up to them to try to get the subpoena set aside or quashed, but that's not on you.
Got it. Have you ever seen an NDA invoked, like where proprietary information was misused and a seller of a business went back to the buyer and said, you're in violation of the NDA?
Yes.
Wow. Can you, if you can remember, like, what was that situation?
I mean, in those cases, you have people who go into court, and without getting into specifics, that could happen in many cases. But my suggestion is, even before you sign an NDA, both the buyer and the seller should sit down and talk about the business. Right. There's a lot of information about the business that's already in the public domain. The information is on the business's website. It's on their marketing brochures. And you could ask the seller just to talk to you about that and see if it makes sense for you to enter into an NDA with the individual. If after a 10, 15, or 20-minute conversation, I'm not interested in the business, I won't even sign it. I won't ask for an NDA. I will destroy my notes, because it just doesn't make sense. And I think it's impolite, and it just creates an additional burden on everyone if you sign this.
Okay, great. All right, more forms and more documents. And we talked the seller's memo, we talked about the NDA. Now you talk about, when you're placing an offer. And there's a lot of different forms and formats. You talk about an indication of interest, a term sheet, a letter of intent, or even an oral offer. Walk us through the differences in these documents. Again, there's an indication of interest, there's a term sheet, there's a letter of intent. And by the way, you're coughing and I'm coughing. So who's ever watching this is gonna catch some kind of virus.
I hope none of us are contagious.
Yeah, I know. You're giving me your cough, or I'm giving you my cough. We haven't figured that out yet. But anyway, okay. So indication of interest, term sheet, letter of intent. Can you what are the differences between these? And do we need these all?
Well, let's go backwards. The only thing that you need to buy a business is a closing.
Yeah.
Where they sign the business over to you and you pay them the money.
Right.
But all these steps beforehand are designed to protect you. So from the earliest stage, you have the indication of interest, where in many cases people say, I'm interested in buying the business at this range and under these terms and conditions. Keep in mind that if you say you're interested in buying the business at a range of $1 to $2, the seller's only going to hear $2.
Right.
You're going to think $1.
Right.
And so, and then after and that's used by the sellers in many cases to narrow down the group of buyers. And then they may ask for a letter of intent. And a letter of intent goes through what everyone agrees to. And in many cases, the letter of intent will include a no shop provision, which means that after the seller signs the letter of intent, they can't talk to anyone else. So the seller is going to generally say, look, I may agree to this, but only for a limited period of time, 30 days, 60 days, because I don't want to tie up my business forever. And the letter of intent may only be good is if you sign a contract to buy the business within X number of days. So the letter of intent summarizes the business terms of the deal, and then it's generally given to the attorneys who put it into a formal document that's signed and the contract. And while this is going on, the buyer is performing due diligence on the seller, and also at the same time, the seller is performing due diligence on the buyer to see if the buyer has the wherewithal, the ability to run the business, has the ability to buy the business, to raise the necessary funds.
All right, so let's dig into that a little bit more because you have a couple chapters about due diligence. So, we get past the point where we have a letter of intent. I am interested in buying this business. I've given an intention of a potential acquisition price and what would be the terms of the deal. But obviously, all of this is based on the completion of my due diligence. Talk to me. Again, I'm a buyer.
Satisfactory completion.
Satisfactory completion. So I'm a buyer now. So speak to me as a buyer. Talk to me about the due diligence I should be doing, and give me an idea of the time frame, and also give me an idea of the people that I should be calling upon to help with this due diligence.
Well, when you perform due diligence, you really want to answer 6 broad questions. First question is, what's the business model? How does the business make money, lose money? What does it do to generate its revenues and expenses? The next item is, what are the business's assets? And not all of a business's assets are listed on its balance sheet. You and I as accountants know that there's going to be inventory and cash and receivables, but what about other assets? They have a trained workforce. They have customers who know about them. They have suppliers who are willing to sell to them. You have liabilities. Liabilities are what's on the balance sheet, but in many small businesses, they don't list their contingent liabilities or their accrued expenses. The most common accrued expense that's omitted from a closely held business's profit on balance sheet are accrued vacation and sick pay, where they owe employees for their vacation and sick pay. The fourth question is, what's going to change? Just as a result of the passage of time, are we going to need things anymore like this? None of us use a travel agent anymore. And what about all the now, like with people working remotely, do we really need as many businesses that service the commuters? And so then the fifth question is, what will change as a result of you purchasing the business? For example, maybe I could bring in new customers, or maybe customers who only bought from the business because they had a relationship with the seller will evaporate. And the sixth item is, what can I do to improve the business? And what can I do to make it better? And that's what's going to happen. Now, how long does it take? It really depends on the quality of the information that the seller has, the responsiveness of the requests, and also the knowledge and the comfort that the buyer has with the business. In many cases, if you're selling to a competitor and assuming you're able to get past all of the issues about the competitor knowing about you, their due diligence could be very short because they know how the business is run. They know what's happening in the industry.
I think another thing that impacts the time frame, I'm assuming, is also the size of the business, right? I mean, if you're buying $1 million versus $100 million business, there's just going to be more time involved. Is there a general sort of rule of thumb as to how long due diligence should take? Is it 30 days, 60 days, something like that? Like, what do you normally say?
It generally takes longer than people expect.
Right.
I don't know. It just seems like in many cases you could buy a business quickly. In their 2014 annual report, Berkshire Hathaway's annual report, Warren Buffett goes through a story of how he met with somebody and within 15 minutes he had a deal to buy the insurance company.
Yeah.
I mean, and one thing, if I could just, a lot of times when people interview for a job, the employer knows within a minute or two whether they want to hire the employee. And I think a buyer knows pretty quickly if they want to buy the business. And the due diligence is just to validate their assumptions.
When I coach Little League and we're selecting our kids for the team, I I could tell within a minute of throwing a ball back and forth with the kid, whether they were a player or not. If there's something that's just inherent, you know what I mean?
Right.
You could just tell. So that kind of information that does not surprise me. Just a little bit of a diversion here. So, we're talking about going through the due diligence process. Give me some advice, Bob, on my team. I mean, this is not a solo effort. I'm assuming you want to put together a team of people to help you go through this process. Talk to me a little bit about what types of people you should be.
Okay, well, you're going to need you're going to need an attorney, and it's not just one attorney, because the knowledge that the attorney is going to need is in transactions and banking and labor,
Yep.
in employee benefits, maybe in environmental issues. So and real estate, possibly leases. You're
Right.
going to need a CPA.
So wait, so I have to interrupt you there, please. Your point about the attorneys, you're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of people, I have clients that go into transaction. They have some business attorney, some guy is a contracts kind of guy and, advise, but he's not an expert in environmental law, certainly not an expert in labor law. And these things are really important nowadays. This is a lot different than it was 20, 30 years ago. So it kind of tells you that either you need to get in, a lot of different attorneys, or you have to sort of bite the bullet and maybe go with a larger firm for a transaction like this that might have those resources. Does that make sense?
A larger firm, or with an attorney who has relationships with people in various areas.
Right.
We've bought businesses and been involved with sales of businesses where they had outposts, or they had offices in various states. We needed to retain attorneys in those states to just be certain that we were in compliance with the laws in those states.
Right. Who are you in these transactions, Bob? Like, you're a consultant, right? So, and I'm assuming your business is such that you would consult with both buyers and sellers depending on the transaction.
Yes.
So again, this conversation is about buying, because that's what this book is about. So how would you, how would you help a buyer of a business?
Well, we try to, among the items is that I'd work with them on compiling their due diligence list, analyzing the due diligence, coordinating the efforts of the attorneys, as well as the CPAs, maybe the insurance people, the bankers, also speaking with suppliers if they'll continue to deal with us. One item that I always suggest that buyers do is possibly survey the customers of a business to see if they're happy. And you could do that on an anonymous basis. We could hire a college student to ask a few questions and use that data as an indicator of what's happening on this. But I work to coordinate everything on this.
That's great. One thing we didn't mention in this conversation, but it is mentioned in the book, it's worth mentioning, is just the importance of also in your due diligence and, evaluating the IT systems of a company as well, because we're in a big data world and data is really important. Do you have any thoughts on that, evaluating a company's IT infrastructure, or the data that they have?
Well, it needs to be looked at very carefully. 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little longer, people had their actual physical computers in their office. And in today's world, it makes a lot of sense to use the cloud and have cloud computing. I can't tell you how many times 7, 8, 9 years ago or more, the owners of businesses lived in fear that their IT person would quit. And now, to the extent that you could outsource that, it makes it easier. It also makes it easier for disaster recovery, for backups, that if, there's a flood or there's a hurricane, something that you don't have to worry about that. And that's really important.
It's almost, I mean, again, this book is about buying, but if you're watching or listening to this and you're thinking of selling your business, it reinforces the importance of moving your systems to some type of managed service provider in the cloud and having cloud-based IT. I mean, I think buyers today are way more amenable to buying companies that have that type of an IT infrastructure, rather than walking in and seeing, a business that's still running on a Windows server and, in the basement of their office building. Right.
Right. And if it doesn't work, someone has to go and kick the computer, and it's very scary on this.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things I could suggest to the buyers is that they need, as part of due diligence, to look at all the contracts and see, are there any items there that could cause a problem? Does anybody have a right of first refusal on a business? We've seen this a lot in the IT businesses. When they start out, the first large customer has the seller or has the owner give them a right of first refusal or an option to buy the business, and that has to be waived. Also, I encourage a business, if they're getting ready for sale, to start generating audited financial statements as opposed to reviews or compilations, because it's an additional cost which could be substantial. But I've never had somebody who sold a business who said it was a mistake to get audited financial statements because that they make that money back many times over when they sell the business. Also, from a buyer's point of view, they want financial statements, but to the extent that you can't have them, keep in mind that a lot of private equity funds will only buy a business if they have audited financial statements. There's many businesses out there that don't have audited financial statements. And that creates a great opportunity for someone buying a business in the lower end of the market, in that you have a whole group of buyers that are not looking at them, and you could look at them. And so long as you're comfortable with the projections for the cash flow, the revenues, the expenses, the income, the outflows and the inflows, you could buy a business that many other people won't even look at.
Yeah, it's such a great point about the audited financial statements. I guess this goes into, I mean, both of our heads are at right now your book on selling a business, and I'm sure you have in that book that if you're going to sell a business, it's a long-term decision. You need to start planning for that well in advance. And one of those things is making sure that you've got audited financial statements for at least, I think, 3 years is what most people like to look at, but the longer the better. Reviewed financial statements are okay, but they're not the same as an audit. And a reviewed financial statement for you guys watching or listening is just where the accountant, is asking questions about fluctuations in a lot of the accounts and the financial statement amounts, but they're not going any further than relying on the representations that are made by management. Whereas an audit, it's a trust but verify thing. So they'll make their representations, but the auditors then go deeper into it and look at the documentation, and that's what you want when you're buying a business. You want to be looking at the financials that have been audited.
Well, for the lowest levels of compilation, where the accountant just takes what the business owner gave and puts it in format, review the accountant does internal testing, and an audit they do internal and external. Yep. But let's assume you're looking at a business and they don't have the quality of financial statements that you want. Get the tax returns. Okay. They're going to help you more than anything, because many businesses prepare their tax returns to minimize their income and base your decisions on the tax return. And that may be a way of short-circuiting this.
It's a great point, because you're absolutely right. The audited, if people are getting external financial statements done, it's usually because a bank is asking for it. And their motivation there is to make their financials look as good as possible for their bank. But when the government's asking for the information on their tax returns, the motivation is to minimize your income to the extent that you can. And that's probably a more realistic picture if you're looking to buy, a business. Bob, when say you get these financials, so you have a whole chapter on metrics. So this kind of dovetails into this. If you get the financial information, you get financial statements, you get tax returns. Give me an idea of some of the metrics that you think are important for a buyer to be looking at, and maybe potential red flags.
Well, among other items is that the tax returns have a schedule M as in Mary 1 and M as in Mary 2, which provides a reconciliation between the differences between the profit and loss statement in the tax return and the balance sheet in the tax return. But in terms of metrics, I always want to look at is year-over-year sales, the gross profit margin. I want to see, are there sales, are there gross profits rising faster than their labor costs, with the understanding that over the last few years, labor costs have risen faster than gross profit. Mm-hmm. I want to look at their business projections, their business plan, and I want to look at how accurate the business plan was in the past compared to their actual results. I want to look at how much does it cost for them to get new customers? What portion of their sales come from recurring revenues? What portion come from repeat customers? How much of their sales are based on forces that are outside their control? For example, if the business is located in more than one country, how much of their income is based on foreign exchange gains and losses, which you and I and almost anyone doesn't have the power to change at all. What portion of their expenses are consumed by fixed costs? So, for example, if the business's recurring revenues are greater than or equal to its fixed costs, that's a good business to buy, because now you know that you'll be able to cover your costs, with the understanding that in the short term, all expenses are fixed, and in the long term, they're all variable.
All right, so much more to talk about there, but I need to move on with a few more questions, and I don't want to keep you too much longer, but this is great. Listen, the meat and potatoes of all this is valuing your business, right? And that's what it's all about. What am I going to sell it for? And if I'm a buyer, what can I buy it for as cheaply as possible, I guess is the best way I can put it. So give me some of your thoughts on valuing a business. people like to value their business based on their assets. Some people like to based on income or future income. Um, what should I be thinking about as I walk into a business? I'm trying to figure out what the value of that business is.
Well, there's many different ways that people use to value a business, but it comes down to what's the future benefits you're going to get from the business,
Right.
whether it be in terms of cash flow, products, market share, things like that. So you're going to look at that. Sometimes people buy a business just to get their technical talent.
Yeah.
That it's just so hard to get people, and they want to get the technical talent on there. But there's the sales multiple, there's the cash flow multiple, there's the price earnings multiple, the discounted cash flow, there's the sales multiple, which I have a problem with because that just values a business based on their sales, but it doesn't tell you what their cash flow is or what their profits are.
Right.
You have replacement costs. What does it cost to replace the product? And I also look at another method is that if I look at the business's cash flow, how much of a loan could that liquidate? That's another way of looking at it.
Right. Are there some industries that they're always valued a particular way versus other industries?
Well, a lot of, for example, tax return preparation practices or tax return preparation businesses are frequently valued based on a multiple of gross. Insurance agencies are a multiple of their gross premiums. Some businesses are based on the number of clicks that go into it, or the number of unique customers that happen. Burglar alarm or security companies, I call them burglar alarm companies, are based on a multiple of annual revenues.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess companies that have recurring revenues, they tend more towards a multiplier of what their revenues are. Sometimes cash flow, sometimes profits. Where do you go for this, Bob? Like, how do you figure that out? If I'm a buyer, who do I talk to? Is it now a time to bring in a firm that specializes in valuing businesses?
Well, I always want to contact trade associations. They generally could help you with that an awful lot. And there's some journals on that. But ultimately, it comes down to what are your future benefits? And keep in mind that just because someone else overpays for businesses doesn't mean that you have to.
Right. Right. Talk to me a little bit about buying assets versus buying stock.
Well, if you buy assets, the beauty of buying assets is that you know exactly what you're getting. And obviously you could assume certain liabilities, and there's no black box that you don't know what you're getting. But from the seller's point of view, they prefer a stock sale because they're going to get capital gains treatment. But if you buy a business with an asset purchase or an asset sale, depending on what side of the table you're on, keep in mind that you may need to have all the contracts that the business has reassigned or assigned to you, which could create some problems on this.
Got it. Okay. Valuation is a big issue for many, for anybody that's looking to, to buy a business. But even as much of an issue is financing the transaction. So you have 2 chapters in the book about just that, whether you're borrowing money traditionally or you're looking for other sources of funds. Run me through some of the more common financing options that buyers usually take advantage of to buy an entity.
Well, most common one is to raise some equity and borrow the balance. And people will borrow it either from their local banks, their credit unions. You could even, insurance companies will lend money, and various other private individuals, but banks are the major source. But the Small Business Administration has programs where they will guarantee the loans to the banks. And obviously you're going to have to provide a guarantee to the SBA, but that also provides another source. The banks are out there, the SBA is out there. And so that's happening a lot.
Is there any type of financing that you find to be more or less popular among businesses? That you've seen? Is it generally traditional bank? I mean, even the SBA financing is usually through a bank. It's an SBA lender,
right?
If it's a 7A loan or even a 504 loan. But I mean, have you been finding, particularly recently over the past certain amount of years, where they're getting more money from private equity or a private investor or family and friends or private lenders versus the traditional Wells Fargo or Citibank?
Well, and I've written I think I discussed this a little in the book, and I've written an article about this. A lot of times I see people going to community banks more
Yeah.
for a smaller business because they know the people, they know the business, they know the area, and they're more comfortable lending on this. And you're right. The SBA, it's better to use an SBA guaranteed lender. So you'll borrow the money from the bank and they'll go to the SBA to get the guarantee from the SBA. And the 7A and the 504 loans are ones. Private equity is generally for larger deals. Private equity is probably the most expensive money you're ever going to borrow.
Hmm.
But at the same time, private equity is not adequately compensated for all the risk they assume. So
Right.
and also it's a validation if you could buy from get private equity, but it's generally not borrowing from private equities. They're gonna take equity in the business. Family and friends are good, but one litmus test that lenders use, and I always use, is how much is the individual and his or her family putting into the business,
Mm,
because that to me is an indication of their confidence on this.
sure. What are your thoughts on seller financing?
I like it.
So
Because a
do I.
couple and I think it could help put together, because when you borrow money to buy a bit, or you're raising money to buy a business, it's a mosaic. You got equity, you got borrowings from third-party lenders such as banks. And to the extent that the seller could help put some of the purchase price in there, it's good. And from the buyer's point of view, it's good because it's less money you have to raise from the lender. It also allows you to defer paying the money on this. From the seller's point of view, it's good for three reasons. Number one is that they could defer paying the taxes on this. Number two, they're going to get a higher interest rate from you than if they put the money in the bank. And if God forbid the seller dies, there's a stepped up basis when the money's owed to them.
Thoughts on using business brokers?
I think they're helpful, but what I find to be important is that you can't let the business broker serve as an obstruction to the deal.
Right.
So often people are coming to me, my students will come to me and say, the business broker won't allow me to talk to the seller.
Mm,
And that stifles everything, because you can't have the communication go through two different people. You need to have a direct conversation. But they are very helpful, especially business brokers who have knowledge of the particular business or the industry, or just willing to facilitate the exchange of information.
Yeah, don't you feel it's a different type of transaction? First of all, this is not a legal argument. You're having a transaction that's being based that you're buying and selling. I understand why a lot of times brokers would try to keep you and me, if we're selling our homes, from not talking to the buyer or vice versa. It's a consumer sort of driven transaction, and consumers can be a little nuts. But on a business level, I would think that if a business broker was holding me back or discouraging me from talking to somebody that I was going to buy their business from, I would think that's a red flag, or I would find
It's
that.
a very big red flag, because the seller has to make a decision whether your money is worth their time to talk to you
Yeah.
about buying their business.
Yeah, and it's their business, and you're making a huge, a large investment, and and it's going to be an ongoing relationship, which brings me to, and we're getting near the end of this, I promise. But going forward, how, if again, this is about buying a business, how often and how much should I assume that if I'm going to buy a business from somebody that the seller is going to stay involved? Is that something that you would recommend to your clients, that you want to keep the seller?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Tell me why.
Unless the sellers had a scorched earth policy, I would always want the seller, because when you buy the business, customers are going to call and say, how did things change?
Yeah.
You say, well, I can't tell you that much, but why don't you talk to the seller? They're down the hall working in their office right now. And it adds for the continuity for the employees, for the customers, for the suppliers, and just for the systems that are in place. And it's very rare that a seller wants to sell the business one day and go home and not have any more contact with it. And I'm using the term seller in the singular format. There could be many sellers, and I got that.
Could be. Is what have you seen as sort of general practice for keeping the seller involved? Do they keep some equity? Is it just a standard, like maybe a consulting arrangement? Is it a seller financing? What do you find to be most amenable or more popular among the transactions?
All of the above. All of the above. The seller could have an earnout where they get a percentage of the sales. But what you as the buyer has to do is figure out, what does the seller do best? Are they best at dealing with customers? Are they best at developing products? Are they best at in sales? And design the earnout so that the seller is compensated for what they do best.
Makes sense. Bob, have I forgotten anything? I mean, there's, for those of you guys that are watching and listening, again, this book it's called A Practical Guide to Buying a Business, Locating a Business, Performing Due Diligence, Valuing the Enterprise, Raising Funds, Closing the Deal. We've scratched the surface, but is there anything significant that you think would be worthwhile that we share in this conversation? Or are you just going to say, go and buy the book?
Well, first of all the money I get from the book is donated to charity. Second of all, if you have any trepidations about buying the business, don't buy it. Right? Because you got to trust your gut on this. And if it comes out, and I go through some reasons why you may not want to buy the business, but if you're not comfortable with it, it doesn't matter that someone else is going to make money on it. You have to be comfortable with it. And it's important. There's lots of businesses out there. There's going to be a lot more businesses for sale with each passing year as more and more people reach the age of retirement and people are saying to move on. So I don't think that's important on this. Also, you have to be comfortable with the business. It has to be something that you want to be comfortable with. Look, I enjoy what I do. I hope I never have to retire. And I don't know if everyone feels that way, but it's got to be something you enjoy.
Yeah. All right. That's great advice. Other than buying your book, are there any other resources that you can recommend for somebody that's buying a business? And other than enrolling as an undergrad student at Wharton, do you offer classes for the general public or anybody outside of
well, number one, I teach graduate students.
Grad students, okay.
And number two, on my firm's webpage and in the book, there's a list of resources. I must have 50 or 100 on various categories. You could go to my firm's website, chalfin.com, and you could get it. I'm just trying to think of one or two that off the top of my head, and the answer is no. But I think you have to develop a team of people, your attorney, your CPA, people you could trust. I got to tell you, I'm real fortunate. I hear from one former student every day, which is probably one of the greatest perquisites of teaching.
Right.
So I hear from them, and I don't want to take up any more time on this.
All right, I appreciate that. I'm going to sign off, but you don't exit yet because I want to say goodbye to you personally. Everybody, you've been watching and listening to BizBooks. My name is Gene Marks. Thank you so much. This book, A Practical Guide to Buying a Business, Locating a Business, Performing Due Diligence, Valuing the Enterprise, Raising Funds, and Closing the Deal by Robert Chalfin or Bob Chalfin. Bob, again, thank you so much for your time. It's a great book.
Thank you.
Essential reading for anybody who's looking to buy a business. Thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you again in 2 weeks. Take care.